Greetings, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this inaugural episode of the Development Context of Sovereign Credit Rating, a podcast by the United Nations Development Programme, that's UNDP and AfriCatalyst. I'm Arnold Segawa, I'll be your host for today. Just to give you some context of what we're going to be delving into this time around, with Africa needing an extra $1.3 trillion annually to advance towards the Sustainable Development Goals, innovative financing and better access to international capital markets are crucial. Recent downgrades by major credit rating agencies have underscored the urgency for African nations to tackle fiscal challenges, fiscal space, and secure development funding. In this episode, we will give you an analysis on the impact of credit downgrades on development financing, particularly at a time when African countries are in dire need of financing. Allow me to introduce my panel today. I do have Daouda Sembene, who is the CEO of AfriCatalyst, and Raymond Gilpin, who is the Chief Economist and Head of Strategy, Analysis and Research at UNDP Africa. Gentlemen, thank you for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, let me start with you, Raymond. Labor Day, massive holiday in the United States. How's that been for you, going to any cookouts?
Thank you so much. It's a beautiful day outside, lots of cookouts, but it's a working day for me because we are conducting a workshop, a regional workshop in Addis, so I'm online.
I can imagine. Daouda, talk to me. How's Addis treating you?
You know, as usual, Addis is so beautiful, so I'm always excited to be here, but especially given the regional workshop that we do have here, so we are very much delighted to be in town. A little bit chilly for a Senegalese like me, who is used to much warmer weather.
I'm always blown away when I hear very beautiful Addis. I'm always very confused which beauty we're talking about, but that's a story for another day. To get into the gist of why we're here, a recent 2023 report published by UNDP showed that close to $74 billion is what could be saved if African countries could borrow at rates determined in a subjective process. Now, I've been going through this report. It's hundreds of pages. Let me start with you, Raymond. Give me a sense of how this $74 billion is actually arrived at. And Daouda, maybe you could come in with the implications of if this was actually offset.
Thank you so much. Let me start with credit ratings themselves. Credit ratings are basically an opinion on a country's creditworthiness. And that opinion is derived through both quantitative and qualitative data. On the quantitative side, there are a number of macroeconomic, institutional, governance data points that go into the calculation that derives the actual ratings. But after that, we do have opinions. When the initial ratings is taken to committee, experts make opinions on whether or not this country being rated is creditworthy or not. There are two issues here. The first is, even though the methodologies that the big three credit ratings agencies use, that's Moody's, Standard & Poor's, and Fitch, even though it is the same applied across the world globally, which is good for reasons from comparison, if nothing else, they are based on the assumption that there is data for every country that will provide great macroeconomic picture and a full institutional/governance picture. We all know for African countries, this is not true. There are problems with data access, problems with data accuracy, and also problems with data timeliness. So what happens in the absence of this data is the subjective judgments, which don't usually go in Africa's favor. We at UNDP see this as a development challenge because when countries are rated below where we think they could be or they should be rated, the cost that they have to pay on debt service is higher, and the amount of money investment they could attract is much lower. And this stymies development progress across the continent, which is why we did this study where we compared the ratings that countries receive from the big three credit ratings agencies to ratings that do not have this subjectivity from a database called Trading Economics. And when we ran the model, we saw that for 19 countries, the amount of savings that could be had is about $74 billion.
Fascinating. It's always interesting to contrast the two. Daouda, let me bring you in. Talk to me about some of the implications here, because you have that report as it stands from UNDP. As AfriCatalyst, walk me through what you see as the implications on a broad spectrum for the continent.
Raymond has reminded us that the groundbreaking studies at UNDP help us sort of estimate the amount of additional debt service payment that African countries are subjected due to subjective credit ratings. This has substantial implications. When we talked about credit ratings, as Raymond indicated, we're talking about agencies on behalf of investors or on behalf of the market trying to give an opinion on how about the capacity and ability and willingness of countries to repay their debt in full and on time. So when you have credit ratings that give an opinion that is not very much aligned with countries' fundamentals, essentially what you're doing is actually you are increasing the interest rate that investors or the market applies to those countries. When you do so, you are actually effectively increasing the amount of debt repayment that those countries actually are subjected to. And what it means is, when we talked about $74 billion that UNDP estimated in terms of additional debt service payment, you're talking about money being diverted away from all the essentials spending, whether it is in social spending, whether we are talking about health, or whether we are talking about education, or whether we are talking about infrastructure development. As you know, many countries in Africa are facing a lack of adequate infrastructure. They're also very much unable to meet some basic service delivery needs. So if you are due to poor or subjective credit ratings, if you are unduly increasing the amount of debt service that they are subjected, you are essentially making it more difficult for those countries to meet those spending or the priorities that I talked about. So I think it means that we need to make sure that, if any subjectivity in credit ratings are subjected to African countries is reduced, so that those countries are, on one hand, able to attract more investment and financing from the international capital market. And the other hand, they are also able to do so at a lower cost than they are subjected right now, which in some cases very unduly.
Listening to the two of you, my head is buzzing because I'm thinking about one coin with two sides. On one end, Raymond, you did mention data or the lack of it or access to it as being an issue or a metric that boils into this methodology, or them actually having this blanket kind of approach towards, the big three having this blanket methodology that they apply. And the reason I'm saying two sides of a coin is because on one end, I'm looking at this as it could be an issue of the data deficiency, which is coming back to actually spike the continent on the back. And on the other side of the coin, I'm looking at it as that risk premium that has always been associated with the African assets or speculative lending on the continent. And I'm thinking, how do we address this holistically with these two sides that I just mentioned?
Thank you so much, Arnold. I think that's an excellent point. The two are actually related. The reason why we have this risk premium is because there is an information asymmetry. And if we're able to address that, then we are making some progress. Let me just mention a couple of ways I think that this could be addressed, but also point out that, now in the media, there's a lot of despair about the downgrade. So Kenya is downgraded, country Y is downgraded. And I see this as an opportunity, more like a wake-up call for African countries. This is an opportunity for countries to say, the reason why over 750 million Africans are living in countries that pay more in terms of debt service than they invest in health and education is partly because the information needed for them to be rated fairly doesn't exist. This is a time to invest in two things. One, in the systems that produce the data that would tell a more accurate story. And secondly, to invest in capacities that would allow African countries to be able to be more efficient and productive in the credit ratings process. As far as the data is concerned, and as far as these two things are concerned, a number of organizations worldwide are working on this. Even the credit ratings agencies are doing it. But at UNDP, we have launched this credit ratings initiative that aims to help build capacity in these two crucial areas, but also support African countries with surge capacity. And we have a concilium of advisors that we're making available to African countries to help them to be able to navigate the process in a way that benefits them. And we recognize this is something we can't do on our own, which is why we're partnering with organizations like AfriCatalyst. We're also partnering with the African peer review mechanism of the African Union. We also have the UN Economic Commission for Africa, because we believe that this should be a holistic approach to addressing this first problem. The credit ratings agencies, as well as the methodologies and processes, but also the data side. The second thing that we need to do, and I think that would be really, really, really helpful in this context, is also to work with the agencies themselves to address some of these challenges. The European Commission did something like this after the 2008-2009 financial crisis, and this resulted in fairer ratings for European countries. I think the time has come for something similar to happen on the African continent.
Right. Thank you for that. Daouda, let me bring you in here. I was looking at some statistics which were quite disturbing. I think this is actually from an AfriCatalyst report that showed that bond issuance has risen from 5% of total debt in 2000 to 22% in 2022. If we're to put that in numbers, we're looking at an increase from 61 billion in 2010 to 163 billion. That's just in debt service for the year, which leaves me thinking it's one thing for us to see the figures, but I understand the likes of AfriCatalyst are partnering, like Raymond was hinting earlier on, with other stakeholders. Talk to me about the initiative that you're actually working on right now, the Credit Ratings Initiative, and how the other stakeholders are coming to the table here.
Well, I think this is an important question. As Raymond was indicating earlier, AfriCatalyst and UNDP have partnered for more than 1.5 years now on this joint Africa Credit Rating Initiative, which is essentially 3 prongs. It has 3 components. The first one is what we call the Africa Credit Rating Resource Platform, which is some one-stop shop for data, methodological information and research on credit ratings. The second component is the concilium of senior advisors who have deep experience and expertise in credit ratings issues, and that AfriCatalyst and UNDP have engaged to provide high-level guidance and support to countries that seeks to improve their credit ratings. And the third component of our joint initiative is the promotion of a community of practice, which would facilitate knowledge sharing and collaboration between government officials. Certainly, Raymond is correct in saying that we need to forge more partnerships between stakeholders, domestic and external, to be able to have something meaningful. So when we talk about partnership, it starts by making sure, first of all, that government officials in Africa are very well aware in the credit rating processes and methodologies so that they can engage effectively credit ratings agencies. So that engagement needs to be proactive and better informed than it has been so far. Of course, partners also need to support. I think the idea of supporting government officials and African countries in strengthening their data framework is critical. And we certainly see scope for many partners to do like UNDP in strengthening capacities in this regard. But at the same time, also, I would like to add that the issue is not just about data. When, for instance, the UNDP talks about subjectivity, I think that subjectivity can also come from other sources like internal procedures and mechanism and the work of credit rating committees where the human factor can play a role. So I think we need to look also beyond the data issue about the other problems. So when, for instance, the credit ratings try to make an opinion on a country, they look at the various issues. They look at the economic performance of the country. They look at also the fiscal stance or the fiscal soundness of the country, as well as the institutional and governance framework of the countries. If those assessments are not favorable, chances are those countries are not going to get a good rating. So in those countries, it is incumbent on the authorities and government in those countries to make sure that they really take necessary policies and reform to strengthen their policy framework and governance framework to make sure that they have sound and prudent fiscal policies and monetary policies. And of course, at the same time, make sure that their structural reforms are very much timely and well sequenced. I think those are important actions that are not necessarily related to data, but that, of course, that falls under the responsibilities of government officials. But at the same time, I believe, and Raymond has said so too, is that we need to find, to create and provide a platform for positive and constructive engagement from all parties, so that there is a better understanding of what the credit rating processes are, and of course for a government official in our continent to be able to engage credit rating agencies more effectively than they have been doing so far. And I think this is the reason why our joint initiative is extremely critical in helping and putting the foundation for such partnership and such engagement to take place. And I believe this is something that we are starting now here in Eastern Africa, and with the hope that we will be able to replicate it in other regions across the continent.
Thank you. Gentlemen, we're actually running out of time, but I want to ask you one last question. And I want both of you to answer this very unobjectively, if I could say, in an opinion-driven manner. I came across a paper when I was reading more about credit rating, that there was a Yalta paper from 2018 titled Credit Rating Agencies Regionally Biased. And I want to throw this over to the two of you, because this paper actually found that there was regional bias towards poorer countries. But when it came to the more advanced economies, the ratings were actually biased upwards. Now, ideally, one would say maybe that's expected, but how can we address this in the near term? I understand there's an initiative. I understand different stakeholders coming to the party, but now this is empirical evidence already proving otherwise. The UNDP also said it, but in a very nice tone by saying subjective. So, Raymond, let me start with you. Daouda, you could jump in as we wrap up.
Thank you so much, Honor. I think as this has been a very interesting discussion about how do we price risk in markets that we don't have full information about. And this is the challenge. Coming in, when you go to markets that you know very well, you could probably anticipate what's going to happen in a year or 2 years, given the policy stances. In African countries, this is not the case. And so the first thing that needs to be done is we need to find ways to improve the availability of reliable information on African markets. And this is not a quick fix. This is something that will happen incrementally over time. And so that it's not just global markets, but also regional markets really understand and able to recognize the opportunity that African markets present. The second thing that could and should be done is that African countries need to move beyond the focusing on how do we invest for today and not what are our long-term goals. Being able to do that gives not just a better sense of confidence to the market, but it also gives better direction to how countries spend their scarce resources. Because then when you're able to do that, you'll find out that for some of the things that African countries are currently borrowing, more prudent economic management and economic governance steps would make more effective use of available domestic resources. And then the third thing I think that needs to be done is we need to have African countries in the driver's seat as far as the ratings processes are concerned. We want African countries to, as they're doing now, in many cases, African governments request ratings, in some cases pay for the ratings, and in doing so, be more involved in the negotiation of the ratings during the processes, and also being more inventive and forthcoming in the presentation of data and policy frameworks, and also governance, economic governance plans, and so that the market has a better view and a more complete perception of actual risk in Africa, not just perceived risk.
Daouda?
Well, I believe I see the improvement of credit ratings in African countries are being a shared responsibilities of all stakeholders that are involved, whether we are talking about the credit rating agencies, but also government officials in Africa. So let's start with the credit rating agencies first. I believe there is a lot of evidence and research that shows that there is room for improving their processes. Some research has shown that there is some subjectivity, and I'm not only referring here to the UNDP research, I'm referring also to the economic literature. Some even goes and sort of estimate that subjectivity to go up to 20%. So I think there is room for those agencies to continue improving their processes and methodologies. And the best way to do so is to be more transparent, increasingly transparent in way of doing business and how their methodological approach. That's one. Another responsibility from credit rating agencies, in my sense, is that they need, of course, to have a better engagement and a better understanding of the country's circumstances. I think there is a lot of talk about many of them having only one office in Africa, and that doesn't necessarily help them understand better the reality of the country. So we see some move toward better understanding the reality of the country, and that needs to continue on the part of credit rating agencies. But I think we would be mistaken in thinking that actually the credit rating agencies are the only cause of the problems that we are talking about here. African countries also have their responsibilities in making sure that they have better credit ratings. And how so? First of all, I think the first action in my mind is to better understand how credit ratings are made and better understand the processes, the credit rating processes that are followed by the major credit rating agencies. And I think this is what our joint initiative with UNDP is trying to do there, because it's extremely critical, so that when they feel like there is some subjectivity, they can call out on those individual credit rating agencies that they are dealing with. That's the one action that is a priority in my mind. Another priority also is to try to improve all those elements and factors that are embedded into the credit rating sort of processes. So whether we are talking about fiscal policies, economic performance, whether we are talking about institutional development, governance framework, all of those are taken into account, and rightly so, by credit rating agencies. And that to really have a good sort of good marks on those issues, it is incumbent on government officials and African countries to make sure that they continue to sustain improvement in these areas, so that they can also ultimately have better ratings going forward. And finally, and I think this is critical, is we need to find a space and a platform for parties involved in the credit ratings business to really engage constructively. I don't think that pointing fingers and finding actually sort of playing the blaming games would actually do it. But what we feel like is important is for credit rating agencies and African government to very much sustain constructive engagement and dialogue so that they can really understand each other and try to improve whatever needs to be improved. We have with our UNDP as part of our convening, we have sensed that there is such appetite from both sides, both from government officials and then also from credit ratings. And we believe that this is something that needs to be facilitated, and UNDP and AfriCatalyst will continue to really make their contribution to make sure that happens sooner than later.
Definitely looking forward to that. And don't forget, this is only the beginning. This is a part of a series of podcasts that we will be bringing your way to just help you understand what goes on to this juggernaut that we call credit rating. Now, there's also going to be a concilium of experts joining us in the course of this podcast series to just try to understand from the experts, from ex-credit rating employees and employers, should I say, to just help us understand what goes on to this very fascinating pot. Allow me to thank my guests for today. As we actually do wrap up, we do have AfriCatalyst CEO, that's Daouda Sembene, and joining us from the United Nations Development Program Africa, that's UNDP Africa, that's Raymond Gilpin, who is the Chief Economist and Head of Strategy, Analysis and Research. I'm your host, Arnold Segawa. Thank you for joining us, and looking forward to the next one. Ta-ta.